For those of you who don't know me, I think that's very few people probably, but I'm the lady who sends you all the emails. Angela Anzano from the Chicago Bar Foundation. Thank you guys for coming. Miguel can't be here today. His daughter is homesick. Our fearless vice chair is here, Ray. But I just wanted to actually flip the agenda a little bit so that we can really focus on Jonathan and all the great wisdom he's going to share with us. And so I'd actually like to start instead with the legislative update and votes, and then we can do kind of other business at the end, like if there's any announcements, but the legislative stuff just in case it takes up any time. So as way of introduction, for those of you who may not be aware, the way that the CBA takes positions on bills is that they all come through a substantive committee. One of the CBA's many committees, including the Legal Aid Committee. And so they have to come through a committee, then they go to the CBA's legislative committee, and then they are voted on by the CBA board. So that's how something becomes part of the CBA's affirmative agenda, meaning that it's a CBA bill, and our lobbyists, Tom and Larry Suffredin, work on it, try and get it passed. And so every year, this committee has really focused so far, the last few years at least, on simplification of process and simplification of language when it comes to the court process in our statutes. And so you guys might remember we changed everything from forcible entry and detainer to eviction a few years ago. We've changed the rules around affidavits in court. We've changed the rules around or the language around the phrase ad damnum and similar language like that. So we have two proposals this year that actually came through the Pro Se Advisory Committee of the Chicago Bar Foundation. And so what that means is that it's a collaboration of a lot of stakeholders that deal in the courts every day with folks who are navigating the courts on their own. And so the two things that came through this year, and they have proposals, and those were sent out to everyone yesterday morning, are modernizing service of process and then simplifying the process to get your name changed in Illinois. So I'd like to take those one at a time, and then if there's any questions, and I'd like to then quickly vote. So the reason for the vote, often for every other piece of legislation that we might look at throughout the year that are other people's bills that we take positions on, you have a subcommittee. If you want to be on that subcommittee, let me know. But that subcommittee handles all of that. But for bills that are going to be ours, we really want to make sure the whole committee has ownership over that and has a chance to weigh in. So that's why we voted this meeting for that. I want to start with the name change simplification. So the idea here is that right now, in order to get a name change, there's a publication requirement and a witness signature requirement. And the language is like he/she, so it's not gender neutral. So we've updated the language to be gender neutral, and it doesn't require you to have a witness, which there wasn't a clear public policy reason when people were researching this for why you would need a witness in order to change your name. And so we've also been working on this bill and similar bills. We've been in talks with Equality Illinois, Chicago House, and some other groups that do LGBT advocacy who also are interested in these issues, and we're planning on having their own bills, and so we're coordinating with them on that. So hopefully that'll be a great collaboration for all of us. So does anyone have any questions about the name change bill? Yeah.
Didn't read it.
Great. Good start.
What about the publication piece? Does it change anything about the publication piece?
Samira?
Yeah, so the proposal would remove the publication requirement in a daily news limited law bulletin, and remove the witness signature requirement, which was cumbersome in two ways. Both it required a credible witness, not defined, so that's just confusing. And second, it had to be a wet ink signature, so it was complicated when that aligned with e-filing. So we are seeking to get rid of both of those, looking only at adult name change so far. And we floated this by folks. We couldn't get any really good public policy requirements for why you need to publish for 6 weeks in Daily Law Bulletin and or have a random credible person watch you sign a piece of paper. So we hope that by removing those, we can streamline it, make it a little simpler for petitioners. They still have to go for the in-person hearing before a judge. So there would still be that check, but some of those procedural hurdles would be removed.
Yeah.
think the answer to that is in the old, like in the 1800s, so you couldn't hide from creditors.
Yes.
Yeah.
The creditors have bought computers since then.
They'll find you, yeah.
Read the same newspaper.
Yeah.
Right.
Any other questions? No? Great. So I just, I mean, I could do like, we could just do a show of hands. I know that's not like super secret or whatever, but you know, is there everyone in favor of us adopting the name change bill? Great. All right. Anyone opposed? It's okay. No? Okay, great. Thank you. No abstentions? Okay. So that one passes. So the second one, just real quick, is the service of process. And so this one, and I just want to be really clear about what it does and does not do. So it seeks to bring service into the 21st century, somewhat. And again, this was in collaboration with the Pro Se Advisory Committee, which does include the Sheriff's Office. So the Sheriff's Office has been a part of this. And full disclosure, it might have gone a little bit further, except that we like to be good partners to all of our partners. So what this does is that it clarifies that if you have tried the sheriff and you have tried a special process server and you have tried all of these other avenues, and your last avenue is publication, which, as Ray so astutely said, means publishing in the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin, which we know everyone reads on a daily basis, that you could petition a judge and have the judge, under judicial discretion, you could serve in alternative ways. And that is in the statute now, but it's not very clear what that means. And so we have just updated it to include, for example, text message, email, social media, or other means deemed approved by the judge and the parties in the case, the case. So I think just want to make it clear that it is an alternative to publication, not an alternative to right off the bat, the sheriff. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Kevin.
So would that get you personal jurisdiction? If the judge said, yes, you can serve by text, they got the text message number, that's their number, the court now has personal jurisdiction over that person, or does it get you essentially to publication, but like subject matter jurisdiction?
I believe it would be subject matter jurisdiction. It would be serving the same function as publication.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Great question, though, and thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
Would this just be added to the language of 203.1, which allows to seek a special order of court?
Yes.
So, like, in terms of the number of email address that we're using, who verifies that that's actually the person?
That's a good question. This is something that's come up a lot. So I think there's a couple things. The statute probably won't go into all of that much, except to say that it'll have to be agreed upon by a judge. And so that'll be something that will have to go into like judicial training and education, making sure that they know kind of, and common sense, right? Making sure that that's actually somebody's email address or profile or whatever, phone number. And then the other piece of that is that our plan is that this would then, a standardized form would be created statewide, and so that would also go into the instructions and the language of that form, making sure that that we're keeping that all in mind and making sure that this is actually good service, some sort of confirmation and all of that. So that would go into sort of the form part of it probably. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
I just have a comment. If social media is going to be included in language, are there privacy concerns that we usually consider with data access to?
So the question is, are there privacy concerns in terms of including social media with data and all of that?
Not something you necessarily have to answer right now, but things like
Yeah.
The way that we had it drafted, it would be through a DM, so not like publicly posting on someone's Facebook wall, but like a private message through a social media platform. So I don't know if that addresses your concerns. If you have others, I'd love to chat with you after, because we're kind of fine tuning the language. We want to make sure we're being thoughtful of any of these other concerns that might come up.
That's really great though. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Ray?
Is there a party or case type in particular that this is seeking to address? Like, is there like one or two very particular needs we're hoping this will address, or is it just publication is outdated and we need to look at what that really means?
I think that it covers all case types, right? So it'll cover everything. But I think that Samira, maybe you can speak to like where you think it will be most helpful.
So in the thing where we've heard it to be a particular challenge for people moving cases forward is in domestic relations case types, where you often have two two pro se litigants against each other in cases it seems routinely are held up for months or even a year or more just on simple service issues, and it can be very, very complicated and challenging for people to move those forward. So I think that's kind of where the idea stemmed from, but as Angela points out, we have broader applicability. And also in full disclosure, we didn't just kind of come up with this on our own. This is modeled somewhat after similar rules that have gone into effect in Alaska and Utah, since these are challenges that other states are experiencing with large numbers of self-represented litigants as well.
Great. Anyone else? Great questions. And these will really help us to continue to fine-tune the language as well and make sure that all these questions are being addressed. And they'll come up throughout the legislative process. So it's good for us to talk about them here. Great. Okay, well, again, I'll do a show of hands. Everyone in favor of the service of process modernization? Great. All opposed? Okay. Any abstentions? No? Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. And without further ado, I'm going to leave it to Jonathan. I'll let him introduce himself. And he's all yours. Don't forget to sign in for CLE credit in the back with your CBA number if you haven't done so already by the time you leave. Thanks.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. I must say this is one of the better attended CBA meetings I've ever been at, so I'm very impressed with this group. So my name is Jonathan Beitner, and I am an attorney, a certified coach, and a well-being and professional development kind of trainer and speaker and things like that. I was a complex commercial litigator at Jenner & Block for just over 6 years until this past January when I left practice to start my own coaching and consulting and kind of speaking business. Although I have a daughter who's turning 5 months old tomorrow, so that's pretty much what I've been doing since I left Jenner, to be perfectly honest. But I'm really excited to be here today to talk about kind of attorney well-being generally, but more specifically ways in which that you can build resilience. And so without further ado, I'm just going to kind of give a quick roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing we're going to do is define what we mean when we talk about attorney well-being and what that term sort of encompasses. Then we're going to talk about what is resilience, why it's important, and then finally the 4 ways in which you can build resilience. And I'm not here to hide the ball on anybody. The 4 ways we're going to talk about are fostering more positivity and optimism in your life, engaging in cognitive reframing, practicing mindfulness, and then practicing self-compassion. So that's, and obviously there's more ways to build resilience than just those 4 things, but those are sort of the main ones we're going to focus on today. Other little housekeeping before we dig into it. I'm happy to stand up here and talk for the hour. I love talking about these topics, and as my wife can attest, an hour I can do that standing on my head. So that's not going to be a problem, but I want this to be as meaningful and impactful for you guys as possible. And I think the best way to do that is to engage in a bit of a dialogue. And if you guys have questions or you want something explained or talked about in more detail, please don't be shy, because if you're sitting there with a question or a comment, chances are someone else has a similar issue or things like that. So any questions before we get started? No? Okay. Okay, so the first thing before we get into the 4 ways specifically, what you'll notice is that they all sort of build in on one another. So I talked about the 4 things being positivity, engaging in cognitive reframing, practicing mindfulness, and self-compassion. And what you'll see is all of those ways are ways to foster more positivity and optimism, and they all sort of build on one another. So similar to a Russian nesting doll. So you'll see sort of the interplay between these things as we go about. So the first thing we're going to do is talk very briefly about, what do we mean when we talk about attorney well-being. So I'm just going to throw it out there. When you hear the term well-being, sort of what comes to mind? Feel free to just shout it out. Come on, group. Don't be shy.
Not drinking all the time.
Not drinking all the time, sure. Being free from substance abuse. That's a good one. Yeah, what else? Sorry, what?
Laying on the beach.
Laying on the beach, relaxing, unwinding. Sure, what else? Going to need at least one more before we move on. So somebody throw, Yoga. Okay, sure. Okay, so the point is there's no one specific thing that sort of encompasses well-being, and that's very intentional. And in fact, one really important movement in the, not just attorney well-being movement, but sort of the wellness space more generally, is this idea of taking a holistic or multidimensional approach to thinking about wellness and well-being. And if you were to kind of Google definition of well-being, you'd find a whole litany of different multidimensional frameworks. Some have as few as 3 dimensions, some as many as 10 dimensions. The number of dimensions and how they're labeled is not nearly as important as this concept of taking a holistic approach to well-being. So the definition we've got on the screen right now is the one that was adopted by the National Task Force on Lawyer Well-Being. And as you can see, it has 6 dimensions. But before we dig into those 6 dimensions, I want to direct your attention to what's in bold at the top of the screen. And I know we've got a very long and narrow room, so it might be tough for you to see in the back. But what it says in the bold there at the top is that well-being is a continuous process in which lawyers strive for thriving in each dimension of their lives. And I want to focus for just a minute on this idea of well-being being a continuous process. You know, maintaining your wellness and your well-being is not something you work towards and accomplish and then you put it in your back pocket and you have it forever. It's not like studying for and passing the bar, right? And then you're admitted in Illinois for, pretty much forever as long as you keep up your CLEs. It's the opposite. It's something you have to be mindful of and work towards every day. So, any questions on that concept before we dig into these 6 dimensions? Okay, so what are the 6 dimensions? The first in purple on your left is emotional well-being. And this is being in touch with your emotions, having a system in place for you to regularly process them. Issues like stress, anxiety, depression would fall under this dimension. Moving kind of counterclockwise along the bottom, social well-being, a very important component of your holistic approach to well-being. We know that there's a lot of links between social well-being and our physical health. There's a study that was in the Harvard Business Review about a year ago now that found loneliness can be as bad for your physical health and your longevity as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So we know it's a huge part, particularly in aging populations. It's one of the best indicators of healthy aging. It's more beneficial than cutting down on obesity or tobacco cessation. So social well-being, really important. It's also very important for sustaining and building resilience. If I had a 5th way, strengthening and having strong social connections and interconnectivity would probably be the 5th one I'd add. The next one on the bottom in green, physical well-being. This is sort of the low-hanging fruit that most people are familiar with, right? Eating right, getting some exercise, getting enough sleep, not engaging in substance abuse, things like that. The next one, spiritual well-being. This doesn't have to be religious in nature, although it certainly can be. But basically, anytime you're talking about meaning with a capital M, purpose with a capital P, fulfillment, these types of things, you're dealing with spiritual well-being. And then at the top in yellow, kind of difficult to read, is intellectual well-being. And this is about kind of your cognitive functioning and the idea that you want to kind of constantly be growing and learning new things and pushing yourself to learn new skills, things like that. And then finally, perhaps my favorite of the dimensions is occupational well-being. And this involves things like having a sense of autonomy and fulfillment at work, being confident in your short-term and long-term career trajectories. Financial security would be subsumed under this model, under occupational well-being. And this one's really important because if you think about it, many of us spend up to half of our time either at work or thinking about work. And so, if you have a lot of stress and are really unsettled in your occupation and at work, that's going to have an impact on other dimensions of your lives. And for me personally, I love this because as a coach, and a lot of the coaching I do involves around career issues. People often ask, "Are you a career coach? Are you this well-being advocate? Which is it?" And to me, while there's not complete overlap between those two, certainly the strategies we're going to talk about today, as far as building resilience as a buffer to maintain your well-being, are things that are going to help you in your professional development and sort of weathering the highs and lows of legal practice. So, any questions on those? Sort of the different dimensions. I know we spent a bit of time on it, but it really sort of lays the foundation for everything. So the other thing I'll say before we move on is that these categories are not rigidly and mutually exclusive, right? There's a ton of overlap. The diagram is supposed to be a bit like a Venn diagram, so there's supposed to be overlap, but it can be kind of tough to see. But any particular issue often impacts multiple dimensions. So I mentioned I have a 5-month-old. One topic that is important to me of late is sleep, right? And getting enough sleep. So which dimension does sleep fall under, you think? Physical, yeah. I think I listed it when I was giving the little litany of physical well-being. So certainly physical well-being is impacted. What else? What other dimensions? Social, how so?
You don't want to talk to
Yeah, sure, yeah, or you don't get enough sleep, you're grumpy, Fraser social relationships. I was giving this program last week, or similar program, not this one, but we were talking about this slide, and someone, they said social, and they brought up that if you're just up late on social media, that'll impact your sleep. And I totally hadn't thought of it that way, but it was an interesting one. Okay, so social, physical, what else? Emotional, right? Yeah, we know there's a lot of research around the ties between sleep deprivation and increase of symptoms of depression, anxiety, things like that. So absolutely. What else? Intellectual, sure. How so?
Because it's hard to think.
Yeah, you're in a fog, right? You can't think, and you're not able to focus, and your mental acumen isn't what it would be. And for the same reason, that's going to impact your occupational well-being, right? If you're not able to function, if you're not able to focus. And vice versa, right? Your occupational status and well-being might impact your ability to get sleep, right? If you've procrastinated and you've got deadlines and you need to pull all-nighters and things like that. So just a quick illustration of a very easy example, simple thing that all of us need to be conscious of, getting enough sleep, and the ways in which it impacts multiple dimensions. So any other questions before we move on to that, from that? Okay, so we're here to talk about resilience. Does anybody want to throw out what resilience means to them? Anybody? Yeah.
Being able to recover from something difficult and still be happy life.
Yeah, so the idea of dealing with adversity, handling setbacks, things like that. And the way I like to think about it is, if we're going along and this is kind of our equilibrium, right, a bad thing happens, and we know negative things are going to happen. The question is, how long can we recover and bounce back up to what our normal baseline was, right? And what I love about resilience as a topic is that it assumes negative events are going to happen, which I think is a good idea because that's life, right? We know there are going to be setbacks. We know there are going to be negative things that happen, particularly for lawyers and the practice of law, right? And so the question is, once you dip down there, are you stuck there? Do you stay down there? Do you dig deeper and dwell and continue to be in this kind of negative space? Because we know as time goes on, more stuff's going to come down the pipe, and you want to make sure you're able to bounce back. So yeah, this idea of just bouncing back, weathering adversity, handling setbacks is what we're talking about here. So why is it important? Why has there been such an increase in interest around attorney well-being in the last few years? Why is resilience so important? The answer for that really starts with the recent publication of some troubling studies with respect to mental health and substance use in the legal profession. There was a groundbreaking study, the title page of which is on the screen, that was published in the Journal of Addiction Medicine in February of 2016, and it was a nationwide study that was commissioned by the American Bar Association and Hazelden Betty Ford. And it found what I like to refer to as unsurprisingly shocking data in the legal profession. What I mean by that is, we've all known, anybody who's practiced law for any length of time knows that it can be a difficult one to operate in, right? There's a bunch of reasons for that, right? Soaring student debt, high stakes, demanding clients, 24/7 expectations, unreasonable co-counsel, clients, and sometimes the people you work with. In a lot of ways, we don't have control over our schedules. All that is true, right? But it's one thing to talk in sort of platitudes about the difficult ways and the ways in which there's a lot of inherent stress in the profession. And it's another thing to have concrete evidence, right? Lawyers are very cerebral and analytical, and we like to have evidence. And so this was a groundbreaking study because it was really the first nationwide empirical look at these issues, really ever. So just for some context, the last study of these issues, and it really was focused on alcohol use in the profession, was a survey of a few hundred attorneys from Washington State in 1990. So almost a generation ago. Whereas this was a study that got almost 13,000 respondents, all practicing attorneys from across the country. So it was a much deeper dive, much better data. So we're going to talk about a few of the most eye-popping studies, but at the end of the program, there'll be a few handouts available, one of which is an attorney well-being resource sheet, that has links to this study and other resources that you might find useful, because there's a ton of data in this study. We're going to talk about just 3 of the most kind of salient and eye-popping data points. So the first of that is going to be about depression. So in this study of almost 13,000 respondents, how many were showing signs of clinical levels of depression at the time they took the survey? So we're going to play a little multiple choice game. I'm going to read the potential answers. When you hear the one you think is correct, just throw your hand up. So who here thinks it was 8%? Nobody ever takes the bait on the first one of the first question, so no worries there. How many people think it was 12%? B. One taker. Okay, how many people think it was C? 28%. Vast majority of people. Anybody going with D? 45%. Couple people. All right. So it was 28%. So over 1 in 4. Big win for everybody, right? 28%, huge. And this is, again, one of those unsurprisingly shocking numbers, right? We know it's a difficult profession. It's another thing to see over 1 in 4 are suffering from clinical levels of depression at the time they took the survey. And that's particularly troubling when you consider that the average of depression rates in the industrialized world tend to hover between 7 and 9%. So that's what that A figure is, right? And for those of you who picked 45%, that's actually the number of respondents who self-reported having struggled with depression at some point in their career. So the survey asked a number of different types of questions. Some of them asked people to just describe their current state, emotional state, or feelings or thoughts at the time they took the survey. And based on those questions, they used the DMS-4 scale or whatever people use for screening depression. That's how they got this number, 28%. But they also asked people to just self-report whether they've struggled with certain issues at any point in their career. And a whopping 45% of respondents said that they had struggled with depression at some point in their career. And it was 60% said they struggled with anxiety at some point. And I like to include those figures as well, because while they're not the most clinical of data points, certainly, right, just asking people to self-report, I think it illustrates just how large and how many people in the profession are struggling with these issues. And as a practical matter, it doesn't really make a difference whether you have a clinical diagnosis or not, right? If you're feeling depressed and you're unable to get out of bed in the morning, that's going to have the same practical impact on you as someone who's, been screened positive for depression. So, any questions on that statistic or those statistics, I suppose, before we move on? Okay, problem drinking. So problem drinking is not the exact same thing as alcoholism. Alcoholism implies a physiological dependency on alcohol, but problem drinking is a defined term in sort of the substance use space. And problem drinking involves drinking behaviors or attitudes that are risky or yellow flags that might lead to alcoholism down the line. So same game, of the 13,000 respondents, what percentage showed signs of problem drinking? Was it A, 10%, B, 21%? No takers. 1, 2, 3, a couple more. C, 33%, a couple more, and B, 42%. Okay, so the good news, I suppose, good in quotes, is that it was B, only 21%, right? So still alarming, right? Still problematic, over 1 in 5, and particularly when you consider, I've seen different stats for what the national average, I saw something that it was 10%, that's why I made that A, but I was just reading something the other day that suggested it was closer to 6%. So again, whatever the actual number is not terribly important. But the idea that lawyers are suffering at rates of problem drinking at over twice the national average is sort of what the problem is, right? And I think, but what's crazy is that every time I do this exercise, I've never had the majority of the room not say C or D. I mean, just every single time people think it's much higher than the actual number, which is in and of itself troublingly high, right? And I think that speaks to the ways in which our profession is just sort of sometimes referred to as soaked in alcohol, and the expectation that alcohol will be at the center of all events is a problem. And those of us in the attorney well-being movement are trying to change that, not to ask people to abstain from drinking altogether. I mean, I drink alcohol, there's a way to do so responsibly, but to get people to think about when they're drinking, how they're drinking, and perhaps most importantly, why they're drinking. Because, we know there's a lot of stress in the profession, and people cope with stress one way or the other, and far too often people are turning to maladaptive and very harmful coping mechanisms like alcohol. I'm just going to say one quick thing about drug use, because I don't have a slide about it. When I read the study, and if you read the study, you might be shocked at how low the rates of drug use are. And the reason for that is because over 75% of the respondents who actually responded opted out of the drug use section. So I'm sure it's because none of them were taking drugs. But to me, that's perhaps the craziest statistic that's come out of the study, and it's not even in the study, right, really. So we know that people are turning to, and maladaptive coping mechanisms at really high rates, and it's one of the things in the attorney well-being movement we're trying to get people to be more mindful and thoughtful about. Any questions about problem drinking? Yeah.
I don't know if you're covering this later, but like depression and drinking, does it break down farther by like age group, like our younger attorneys versus older attorneys?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for those are listening to this on a videotape later, the question does the study break things down by age group or other kind of more granular detail? And the answer is yes. So I encourage everybody to check out the study. It has breakdowns for age, gender, and segment of the profession. So like in-house attorneys, law firm attorneys, government, stuff like that. And what's interesting, and I was just making this point yesterday when I was talking to some law students at DePaul, when they asked about like big law and sort of the reputation it has. There are some differences among those segments of the profession, but they're not nearly as disparate as you might think, or what kind of conventional wisdom about kind of different jobs within the profession, right? The rates were higher among younger attorneys, which was one thing that was different from that 1990 study. The traditional thinking used to be that alcohol, problem drinking and alcoholism went up as you went longer into your career. But from this study, actually that 33% number is actually the rate of problem drinking among attorneys that have been out of the profession for 10 years. So that was higher. Incidents of mental health issues were a little higher among younger attorneys. They were a little higher among like law firm attorneys, but not like huge rates. And it was weird. It was like, you might find this troubling. It was like law firm attorneys and people who work in bar associations like had the worst rates. You know, and I think that's just like sampling and stuff like that. You know, but it's just the point being that, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're in public sector or you work for government or you're in a law firm or you're in-house, right? We're all dealing with stressors because of the nature of the practice of law, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but really good question, thanks. Any others? We got one more stat from the study. So the last one is about suicide ideation, suicidal thoughts. And again, this was one of the statistics where they asked people to respond or self-report if they've struggled with an issue at any point in their career. So again, same show of hands. What percentage of respondents self-reported having engaged in suicidal ideation at some point in their career? Was it A, 3%? Yeah, one hand. B, 5%. Bunch more, probably the majority. C, 8%. A few more. Anybody going D, over 10%? Two hands in the back. And we have two people who are correct. Yeah, again, unsurprisingly shocking data, right? I mean, it's one thing to say it's a difficult profession. It's another thing to see over 1 in 10. Again, of the people who felt comfortable enough to respond to the survey in the first place, right? So, I mean, I personally, not a statistician at all, but I tend to believe all these numbers are underreported just because of the way they elicited responses and things like that. So over 10%, the actual number is 11.2% engaged in suicide ideation at some point in their career. For those of you who, I think there were some people who raised their hand for A, that's the number of respondents who reported engaging in some form of self-harm in their career. That was 2.9%. So, okay, really troubling stuff, right? The good news is that this study really has served as a loud and clear wake-up call. There's been a whole litany of task forces and subcommittees and statewide and national initiatives and things like that. And I'm not going to go into too much of that in this presentation, but in that attorney well-being resource sheet that will be available later, there's links to all sorts of cool stuff that's going on. One thing I do want to mention before we move on to sort of the 4 ways to build resilience is the ABA has launched a well-being pledge campaign that was launched in September of 2018, and I was one of the co-creators of that pledge. And it basically was challenges legal employers of all stripes, so law firms, corporate legal departments, government agencies, nonprofits, law schools, anybody who employs a lawyer, to commit to 7 kind of broad-based principles to bolster the well-being of their attorneys and staff. So things like putting on educational opportunities like this program, de-emphasizing alcohol, the expectation of alcohol at events, fostering a culture of self-care and help-seeking behavior, things like that. And I bring it out here because some of the feedback we've gotten, and the pledge campaign is going tremendously well. We were about 14 months in, and we have over 150 law firms and corporate legal departments and law schools and increasingly government entities. And so one of the pieces of feedback we've gotten back is that people think it's just for law firms. So if people have heard about this, if you are at an organization or company or firm or whatever the case may be, and you're interested about the pledge, please reach out to me or check out the information that'll be on that handout, because we're really trying to grow the ranks beyond just the law firm community. We have our first couple of government entities, the Attorney General's Office of Massachusetts and the ARDC here in Illinois, our recent pledge signatories. So just wanted to highlight that. Okay, any questions about the ABA Hazelden study? There was a similar study that came out at the same time about law students that showed similarly troubling statistics. I'm not going to get into all of that, but the message is people enter law school with kind of this average rates of these issues, and even by the end of their first year, huge spikes, particularly in depression rates. So, these studies, this one came out in February of 2016. The law school one came out in December of 2015. Really, since then, that's why you've seen this kind of explosion of interest and programming around attorney well-being. So, any questions about those? Okay, cool. Okay, so oftentimes, even when nobody answers or raises their hand when I ask any questions about the study, oftentimes people ask, well, why are lawyers suffering at higher rates than the national average, right? And we talked about a few of those at the onset, right? Student debt, 24/7 client demands, high expectations, uncontrollable schedules, things like that. But and those are all true, right? There's no one answer to this question. But one explanation that really resonates with me is this idea that the practice of law and lawyers are very pessimistic, combative, adversarial, kind of zero-sum game. And there's actually some statistics to back this up. So there was a North Carolina Bar Association study that found over half of lawyers have what's referred to as a negative attributional style. And if you don't know what an attributional style is, don't worry, I had to look it up when I read that study as well. An attributional style is simply the way in which we explain events, their causes, and their consequences to ourselves. And for that reason, it's sometimes also referred to as an explanatory style. So people who have a negative attributional or explanatory style, when setbacks happen, they tend to catastrophize them. They tend to focus on the negative in the situation. They tend to get preoccupied with the setback and how detrimental it will be. And they tend to look at obstacles and adverse situations as more permanent and insurmountable than they might actually be. Whereas the flip side of that, people with a positive or optimistic attributional style tend to think of setbacks as, opportunities to learn or grow from. They're much more easily able to see the silver lining in situations and move forward with kind of a more productive mindset. So why is that, right? And there are kind of two broad explanations for this, I think. The first is that we're all sort of hardwired for pessimism, not just lawyers, right? All humans have developed what's referred to as an implicit negative bias. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what an implicit negative bias is, it simply means that we give greater weight and internalize negative events more profoundly than positive events. Okay? And there's a lot of research around this. The general thinking is that it takes 3 positive events of the same or equal magnitude to offset 1 negative event. And there's debate in the literature. Some people say it's 5-to-1. Some people say the ratio is 7-to-1. What the actual ratio is not terribly important, right? What is important is this idea that we internalize and give greater weight to negative events over positive events in an exponential manner, right? Any questions about that idea? Because it's really sort of at the heart of all this stuff. Okay, so why is that, right? Why do we all have this? This implicit negative bias is not a lawyer problem. It's an everybody problem. The reason is actually has an anthropological and kind of evolutionary underpinning to it. As early man was developing, the negative events in our lives tended to take the form of existential threats, right? It was a saber-toothed tiger coming to maul and kill us. It's if we're out hunting and gathering for food, you pick the wrong berry, it's poisonous, and that's the ball game, right? Early man didn't have a whole lot going on, right? It was mostly just trying to stay alive. And so the negative events that took place in their day-to-day lives were these existential threats. And so it was really important to be on the lookout for negative events, right? And so this implicit negative bias developed where we are constantly scanning our surroundings and our circumstances for threats, for danger, for what might be negatively impacting us, right? And it's also very true for our social relationships, right? Because as early man was developing, our social ties and familiar relationships and tribes and clans and things like that were hugely important for our survival, right? And so we were very, very cognizant and on the lookout for social friction and for how things might be going poorly in our relationships. And so that stuck with us, right? Because at the time, that was an adaptive trait, right? That helped us stay alive, and so that's why we all have it, right? The problem is, as society has changed, as we've changed, we face different challenges, right? Thankfully, most of us do not face existential threats on a day-to-day basis, right? We have a lot of stress, but it's not a saber-toothed tiger looming at us, right? It's a deadline coming down our calendar, right? Maybe it's that we have to get up and give a presentation in court or in front of a room full of people, right? And so that's good, right? We don't want to be dealing with saber-toothed tigers and things like that. But the problem is we have these stressors and we have so many more of them, right? Because we're so much more connected. We have access to so much more information. Our lives move so much faster and there's so much more to them that we still experience these stressors. And physiologically speaking, our bodies respond to that looming deadline the same way we responded to the saber-toothed tigers, tens of thousands of years ago or whatever it was. Right? We don't have time to get into all the neuroscience of it. It's all very interesting. But essentially, our body goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Our body releases cortisol and adrenaline and all sorts of other hormones and things like that. And that can be very corrosive when we engage in that cycle over and over and over again on a daily basis. Right? So that's the first part. Any questions on this implicit negative bias and how it developed? Okay, so everybody's got that. But then as lawyers, we sort of double down and exacerbate the effects of that implicit negative bias by the way we're trained and by sort of the attributes the profession self-selects for. So what do I mean by that? So if you think back to your first law school exam, more likely than not it took the form of anybody want to hazard a guess? An issue spotter test, right? Huge swaths of legal training are predicated on the idea that we're going to give you a factual scenario and you're going to tell us everything that's wrong with it. And that's exactly what the implicit negative bias does, right? We're constantly scanning our circumstances and our surrounding for negative events, right? And so we're trained and conditioned to double down and exacerbate that impulse to search for the negative, right? Because then in law school, it's like, okay, identify everything that's wrong, address it, and then identify everything that might be wrong with you or the ways in which you address it, right? And kind of go back and forth, right? And so we're constantly dealing, and as lawyers, right, we're constantly dealing in, what's the worst case scenario? What's our litigation exposure? How might this deal fall apart down the road? Right? And that's important, right? Another explanation for why lawyers suffer at higher rates is that at its core, the legal practice is about us taking on other people's problems and helping them deal with it, right? And in the legal aid community, right, nobody knows that better than this group, right? And so that can be very difficult to deal with, and particularly when the stakes are super high, right? And because we have that pressure, and in order to be good counselors and advocates and attorneys, right, it's important for us for our clients, think in that terms of how might this go wrong, and what's the worst case scenario, and what's our liability exposure, and all this kind of stuff, right? It's important for being good lawyers, and that's why legal training looks the way it does. The problem is when that modality of thinking permeates our whole lives and really is the only way we think, right? Because it has this loop of sort of negative feedback in our lives that can be very debilitating over time. The other thing is that lawyers tend to be very competitive, very cerebral, very analytical, and very smart, right? And we like to know the answer, right? Clients come to us with questions and we try to give them the answer, right? And so we're constantly trying to come up with the answer in situations. But we know in life, it's filled with imperfect information, and there's many things that are unknowable, right? But because we like to tell ourselves stories and give ourselves the answers, what ends up happening is we tend to fill in the gaps of our information, and because of the way we're trained and because it exacerbates our implicit negative bias, we usually fill in those gaps with the worst case scenario, right? Attorneys are notoriously risk averse and conservative and cautious in ways in which the business community just is aghast and can't understand it, right? And that's part of the reason, because we have this very conservative approach to thinking sort of what's the worst case scenario, what's our liability, what's our exposure, right? And so because of that, when we're faced with uncertain information or imperfect information, when we're filling in those gaps in a really negative way and with this kind of inherent pessimism, it leads to all sorts of common thinking errors, right? I do a whole program where it's titled Understanding and Avoiding 10 Common Thinking Errors, and it's all about the ways in which this pessimism twists our perception of, life and the world around us into these different thinking errors. So we don't have time to go into all of them, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of them and how they relate to resilience, right? So we talked about resilience being the way in which we weather adversity and overcome setbacks. Well, when we catastrophize, like Chicken Little here all the way to the left, right, we're only making things worse, right? We're compounding the problem. And it's going to be very hard once we drop down to get back out once we catastrophize. Right? Another thinking error is when we overgeneralize, right? And we think in absolutist terms, right? Things are always a certain way or they're never, right? And that can be particularly harmful and prevalent when setbacks happen, right? Just as like a very light, quick illustration, right? If you're going to catch the bus and as you pull up to the bus stop, the bus is, pulling away and you think to yourself, I can never catch a break, right? You're overgeneralizing there, right? Overgeneralizing it at its core is when you take a data point that may or may not be true and you extrapolate it to support a conclusion that is way too broad, right? So negative things are going to happen. We know that. But when we get in this mindset, it's like, things are always, the deck is stacked against me. Things never go my way. We start thinking in this absolutist way. It leads to problems. Fortune telling, another thinking error, right? We try to predict what's going to happen, and often when we infuse that interpretation and that our prediction of what's going to happen with pessimism and sort of the worst case reading, it holds us back in a lot of ways, and it also makes it much more difficult to bounce back up when bad things happen. And finally, Barbie represents the unreal ideal or perfectionism, right? Another problem that can chip away at our resilience, right? When we're feeling low and we think, okay, the only way to turn it around is if things go perfectly, right? And so often, perfectionism is another great example of an adaptive trait that can get maladaptive on you really quick, right? Because a lot of times, particularly for lawyers, our perfectionist tendencies have been really helpful and useful, getting us through school and making us be hard workers and doing a good job. But it's when we kind of go overboard in that respect and, we have trouble turning something in or filing something because, we know it could be better or we think there are problems and it's not perfect, it becomes maladaptive and very detrimental to our health. So any questions on those things? Okay. So what can we do? Particularly now we're going to turn to the ways in which we build resilience. So as I said at the onset, the big thing, the umbrella tip and strategy is to foster more positivity and optimism in your life. And the point is to blunt that implicit negative bias, which distorts the way in which we view things and our risk-reward calculation and our judgment in all sorts of ways that we talked about with the thinking errors, right? We want to blunt that 3-to-1 ratio so that it's closer to 1-to-1, or how different would our lives be if we gave greater weight to positive events over negative events, right? So, okay, the good news is we can do this, right? We now know through a concept called neuroplasticity that there are things we can do, very simple things we can do to kind of change the neurochemistry in our brains and sort of our outlook in general, right? So it used to be the case that we thought our behaviors and our attitudes were kind of locked in, right, after the age of like 3 or something kind of wild like that. But we now know that the brain is just like any other muscle, and there are things you can do to kind of train it to strengthen certain aspects of it that are associated with kind of more positive and beneficial ways of thinking. And one of those is positivity. And there's research that shows that our attitude and our kind of that attributional style we were talking about at the beginning is only 25% genetically based, right? So that there is some idea to the concept that some people are just born with a bubblier, kind of sunnier disposition, and other people are kind of more grouchy and curmudgeon-y. But it's a really small piece of the puzzle, right? And there are very simple things you can do to have an effect on your outlook and optimism levels. Okay, so what are they? The first two are really straightforward. So I'm just going to let you know, none of this stuff's going to blow your hair back and be terribly confusing, right? I mean, that's part of the beauty of it, that these are really simple things that you can do that have a really strong, appreciable impact on your outlook, which will have a big impact on the rest of your life. So the first two, very straightforward, right? Recognizing positive events, expressing gratitude. Pretty straightforward to see why those would help you foster more positivity and optimism. But I do want to talk about a couple of things with respect to these exercises. And these are the two that have by far the most neuro and behavioral science research behind them. So there's a couple ways you could do this, right? You could just think to yourself good things that happen or things you're grateful for. You could share them with others, right? You come home from the dinner table, somebody in your family asks, how was your day? And this was good and I was grateful for this. Great, right? And that also helps strengthen your social connectivity, which we talked about at the beginning being really important, right? And research shows that saying stuff out loud and sharing these experiences with others will give you more benefit in this respect. The other thing you could do is write it down, right? And gratitude journaling is all the rage now. And there's if you go on Etsy and you were to Google gratitude journal, you get a million different templates and things like this. There's research that shows writing down 3 good things that happen to you each day has a huge impact on your outlook and attitude. Same thing with expressing gratitude. There was a researcher out of UC Irvine that found writing down one thing you're grateful for a day increased happiness by 25%. And I'm not going to lie to you, I don't know exactly how they measured happiness. I'm sure it was with a survey of some sort. But even if you don't buy that science as hard data, right, it's very intuitive why these exercises would help you foster more positivity and optimism, right? And there's something about writing things down. Again, you don't have time to go into all the neuroscience, but you activate different parts of your brain that deal with language and things like that, and it helps you internalize and get the impact of these exercises more profoundly. So the last thing about these things, as you're thinking about your positive events and the things you're grateful for, the key is to be as specific and have them be as novel as possible. All right? Okay, and what I mean by that is, I love my wife, but if my good thing that happened today and the thing I'm grateful for each day is just that I'm married to Leah and it's great, as an exercise for your brain, it's not the best rep, right? What is better is when you think of things that are novel or with greater specificity, right? So a better exercise would be, I'm really grateful that Leah woke up early to walk our dog so I could sleep later, that type of thing. So any questions on these first two? Okay. The next one, doing good things for others. Again, very straightforward, right? We've known for a very long time that when we do good things for other people, we get a lot of benefit. One of those benefits is fostering a more positive and optimistic outlook. Pretty straightforward. Not going to spend a lot more time on that. Setting and working towards attainable goals. This one is really important, and in my coaching work, this is one I focus on with clients a lot, right? Making sure that our goals and the things we're working towards are attainable and realistic, right? Maybe you've heard of SMART goal setting, but basically that says make sure your goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to your broader goals, and time-based. And the idea being that when we dip down, right, when we have those negative events, it can be hard to see the light, right, and we feel really low and whatever. And if we set our goals as being kind of too big or unmanageable or unrealistic, it's only going to cause us to, it's going to have the opposite effect of building resilience, right? It's going to make us feel worse about the situation because we're setting ourselves up for failure. And again, with these, like all other things, working towards attainable goals, tracking your progress can be really helpful, right? So you can see sort of the momentum, because we know the best indicator of future success is past success. So when you set small attainable goals, and you sort of build on those successes. Okay, so fostering more positivity and optimism, we told you, that was sort of the largest of the Russian nesting dolls. And now the next two things are reframing, engaging in cognitive reframing and practicing mindfulness are two ways in which you build positivity and optimism, but they've also been proven to help build and bolster resilience. So engaging in cognitive reframing. This is simply, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, cognitive reframing is simply looking at the same situation in more than one way. And we can see why this would be so beneficial for building resilience, right? Because when we have that setback and we have that adversity, if we can think of different ways to look at it besides, oh my God, look how bad this is, and that first natural impulse to catastrophize and focus on the negative, which is informed by our implicit negative bias, when we can break the habit of that modality of thinking and in turn ask ourselves, well, what might be the silver lining here? And that's what this is a picture of, for those of you who maybe couldn't tell. That's a cloud with a silver lining. Thank you, Google Images. Even if there's no real positive out of the situation, what's something I can learn from this experience? Or if there's nothing how can I, moving forward, avoid this negative situation, right? And so it's about switching from this catastrophic, negative, pessimistic mindset to kind of a more productive, solution-oriented one. Does that make sense? And, I sometimes get pushback from people who are like, oh, you just want us to bury our heads in the sand and turn a blind eye and wear rose-tinted glasses and a number of other kind of euphemisms and metaphors. I'm a realist. This isn't for me. This is ridiculous. And at its core, cognitive reframing is not about sugarcoating things, right? It's not about making up positive things that aren't there. It's simply about recognizing that in all situations, there's going to be things that are good about the situation and things that are bad, or things that are more negative and more positive. And it's simply about choosing where you want to focus your energy, right? Bad things are going to happen. That much we know for certain, right? And so it's all about how do we want to move forward once that bad thing happens. And I think that idea is encapsulated in this quote that I love, right? Which is, life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it. And I think for the practice of law, that's particularly true, right? There's so many things about the practice of law that we can't control, right? Deadlines, whether clients are going to show up to meetings, whether they're going to get the information they promised you, whether the court's going to rule at a certain time, or unpredictable co-counsel or opposing counsel. There's so much that we can't control, and particularly for young attorneys, right? A lot of times we can feel like we're at the affect of life. But the fact of the matter is we have a lot more control and power than it feels like at times. And one of the ways we can exercise that control most clearly is the way in which we respond to things, and particularly the way in which we respond to negative things. So for those people who feel like, oh, I'm a realist, I'm not going to engage in cognitive reframing. If you really want to be realistic, you need to acknowledge that your implicit negative bias is skewing the way in which you are filtering things that happen to you in the world around you. And that, if you want to be a realist, we really should be trying to get to that 1-to-1 ratio. Any questions on that? Okay, so the third of our 4 things is practicing mindfulness. And this is a topic I forgot to say at the beginning of my introduction. So I'm chair of the CBA's Well-Being and Mindfulness Committees. Or they're one committee now. There used to be 2, and now they're 1. So mindfulness is near and dear to my heart. And last year we put on a whole half-day workshop about it. So we're not going to cover it in the 15 minutes we've got left here. But for those of you who may not be familiar with what mindfulness is, it is the state of awareness that arises when we pay attention in 3 specific ways. When we pay attention to the present moment, on purpose, in a non-judgmental manner. Okay? And that definition is important for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's a state of awareness. It's not something that you necessarily do, right? You can practice mindfulness in a number of ways, but it's not something you necessarily do. A lot of people conflate meditation and mindfulness. Meditation is simply kind of the most common way people practice mindfulness. But you can do it in an infinite number of ways, because all it is about is focusing on the present moment as opposed to ruminating about the past or worrying about the future. And so that present moment can be anything. It can be what you're presently thinking, feeling, smelling, doing, tasting. And so, you can brush your teeth mindfully. You can, walk to the bus stop mindfully. As long as you're focusing on the present moment, on purpose, in a non-judgmental way. And that non-judgmental way is really the most important aspect of the definition as it relates to building resilience and fostering more positivity and optimism, right? Because so often we're very critical of our thoughts. We can be very tough on ourselves. And this is illustrated most often when people try to meditate originally, right? Their mind wanders and they get really tough on themselves. And they're like, oh, I'm not doing this right. This is so stupid, right? But the key is to just, when you're practicing mindfulness, you're just simply acknowledging what is in front of you in that present moment, right? Without labeling it good or bad, right or wrong, these types of things. And that non-judgmental attitude, which really, as you practice mindfulness more and more, kind of permeates throughout your lives, is really beneficial to blunting that implicit negative bias, helping you foster more positivity and avoiding kind of those thinking errors of catastrophizing situations and overgeneralizing them. So any questions about that? I know we just stuffed a lot into a big topic into a very small amount of time. So if anybody has questions about that, happy to talk after or at any point there. So, okay, the 4th one, practicing self-compassion. And again, we talked about the Russian nesting dolls. So that last part of the definition of mindfulness really segues into self-compassion, right? Because when you're evaluating your thoughts in a more non-judgmental way, you are going to inevitably foster more self-compassion, because generally speaking, people are very hard on themselves as a general matter. And if you think about, when you make a mistake and you start to get hard on yourself, one of the strategies that in my coaching I use and people recommend is, you think about what if your friend had done that, or a colleague or a coworker had done something similar. Oftentimes we're way more forgiving, way more lenient, way more understanding when it comes to other people as opposed to ourselves, right? And so the Russian nesting doll within mindfulness is self-compassion, because that practicing mindfulness helps you develop self-compassion. And we know self-compassion is really important for building resilience, because, again, once you drop down there, it's all about how are you going to react once you're down there, right? Are you going to continue to be hard on yourself and feel crappy and kind of stay down there until the next bad thing happens and you get even lower? Or are you going to kind of give yourself a break, cut yourself some slack, and make it easier to kind of crawl out there? And we've got the picture of the kangaroo up on the screen, because there was an Australian study that showed self-compassion was the thing that was most beneficial for breaking the correlation between perfectionism, right? It was something that's kind of rampant in the legal profession, and symptoms of depression. So, right, when people are perfectionists, they oftentimes develop symptoms of depression and get depressed. And self-compassion is really the thing that's been proven to kind of break the link between those two concepts most strongly. Right? And intuitively, it makes sense why that would be helpful for building compassion. Okay, so any questions on that or any of the 4 things we've talked about before we move on to the next component? Okay, so like I said, all of those things are pretty straightforward, right? Recognizing positive events, expressing gratitude, engaging in cognitive reframing, doing good deeds for others. None of those are terribly difficult things to do. The key is you need to do them over and over again, right? Habitually, right? And that's why we've got this photo up here, because what it's like doing these very simple things is it's like walking or riding a bike over grass. Do them over and over again, and you eventually make that groove, you create that pathway. And that's exactly what's going on in your brain with the neurochemistry, right? You do these simple things like expressing gratitude, and you're strengthening the neural pathways of your brain that are associated, or the neural pathways in the parts of your brain that are associated with positive thinking, right? There's a saying in sort of the neuroscience world that neurons that fire together wire together. And it's that idea that as we do things over and over and over again, we habitualize them and then we strengthen them, and that's what's actually, when we're talking about neuroplasticity, that's the work that's being done. And it's very interesting, right? Mindfulness in particular, people talk about it all the time as being this kind of superpower, tool in your toolkit thing that's good for everything. And the reason it's good for everything is because practicing mindfulness strengthens the neural connections in your brain that are associated with accessing your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that sits right above your nose, between your eyes, and is associated with all sorts of things like wise decision making, emotional regulation, focus, all sorts of things that help us do critical thinking and decision making that are important. So it doesn't matter what you're trying to do, mindfulness can help you do it because it helps you tap into the part of your brain that is associated with critical decision making. And it's interesting because this repetition works for the positive things we've talked about the same way procrastination and substance use works in the negative way, right? At its core, right, people develop substance use disorders because of they cope in negative ways by, they're under stress and they reach for alcohol, and they do that again and they do that again, and then they do it habitually, and then your brain it changes the wiring in your brain, right? Because you're activating the reward center of your brain when you're avoiding the task by avoiding the stressor by reaching for alcohol. And so that's how you develop a physiological dependency, right? Same thing with procrastination. I was listening to a therapist speak one time, a mental health practitioner, and she was explaining how procrastination is a lot like a drug, right? You're under stress, and so you avoid it by procrastinating, and you get that dopamine hit, and it becomes like a drug. And it's the same way. When you do things over and over and over again, your first reaction is to go towards them, right? And so that works for positive things the same way it works for negative things. So the key is to try to find a way to habitualize these activities. And to that end, we talked about journaling a bit as we were talking about recognizing positive events and expressing gratitude. I've been giving this talk or one similar about fostering positivity and optimism for a little while, and I went through a rough patch in my personal life that was getting me down, and I was thinking, I need to find a way to incorporate these different strategies and techniques into kind of one exercise that I can do every day, because I know doing it repeatedly, that is what gives you the benefit. And so I created this bullet journal template, and this is another handout that'll be available after this program, to try to take all of those tips and a few other ones that help bolster well-being and put them into one exercise that I could do every day. And I can do this now. It's just one side of one sheet of paper that I break into 9 squares or quadrants or whatever. And then bullet journaling, for those of you who aren't familiar, is just what it sounds like. You fill in those headings with bullets, right? So one word, one phrase. It's really quick and easy and very fast. And it captures a ton of information in ways in which, Dear Diary, exercises might take a really long time. So what are they? They're all pretty straightforward and somewhat self-explanatory, but just real quick in the last few minutes we've got here. The top row, highlights, lowlights reframed. Pretty straightforward. Highlights, you're going to recognize your positive events. Lowlights, again, we're acknowledging that in all things, every day, there's going to be things that are good and things that are bad, right? And we talked about at the very beginning when we were talking about the definition of well-being, how finding a methodology for processing your emotions is really important. And I have found bullet journaling to be a really fantastic way to do it. And so, bad things are going to happen, and getting them out on paper, again, you use a different part of your brain when you write stuff down. And so that is, from a physiological standpoint, one way to process your emotions is writing them down. And then lowlights reframed, right? Once you acknowledge the low light, it's a good opportunity to engage in that cognitive reframing and think about how that negative event might not be as bad as it feels, right? Might not be as big a deal. And one thing that I love for this part of the exercise, a speaker I was listening to relatively recently, she put it this way. When bad things happen to me, I ask myself, how am I going to feel about this in 15 years, right? And the answer is you're not going to care at all, right, for the vast majority of things, right? It's just another way to kind of put things into perspective. The middle row there on the left is self-care. And I just put there anything that bolsters one of those 6 dimensions we talked about at the beginning. And you'll see, this exercise might be a little uncomfortable at first, but as you do it over and over again, you'll see how easy it is to tie really anything in your day to one of those 6 dimensions. And the other thing that's good for is there are a lot of things that I do kind of repeatedly that make it onto there. I've been trying to floss a lot more, so every time I floss, I put that in. And it's important because you should, if someone were to ask you, what do you do for self-care, and you have no idea how you would answer that question, that's a real problem, right? And so one of the things that journaling is great for is just kind of checking in and as a form of accountability for yourself and all sorts of things like that. And so you'll start to see, oh, well, this is what I do. I read a novel, sci-fi or fantasy novel. I listen to music. Like all these things are not traditional self-care things that you might think of, but they are, and they're beneficial. So anything that bolsters one of those 6 dimensions I put in there. Gratitude, it's in the center square because it's the kind of, I don't want to say most important, but it's the one by far with the most research behind it. And so, again, expressing things you're grateful for. A lot of research that says even just one thing is great. I try to shoot for, double digits every day if I can, because why not? How's it going? This is kind of a more traditional Dear Diary square for me, and this is, I just kind of check in. It's kind of my practicing mindfulness. Journaling in general is a mindfulness activity, so you don't necessarily need this specifically, but I just use it as a rough cut how I'm feeling whenever I'm engaging in the exercise. At the bottom, social connectivity and connections. We talked about social well-being being a really important dimension of your holistic approach to wellness. And again, journaling is a way to check in, right? And so if I find that I'm just writing my wife, my baby, and my dog in that square a couple days in a row, that's a signal to me that I need to reach out, call my mom, set up lunch with a colleague, do whatever, right? Because you want to be mindful of it. Like we talked about at the beginning, well-being is a continuous process, right? It's something we have to check in on every day. Food, I just really like to eat. I'm trying to eat a little healthier. And again, journaling is a form of accountability, right? As a coach, one huge part about coaching is being there as a source of accountability, and journaling is a way to kind of account for things. And if you're going to have to write something down, maybe you only have 2 donuts instead of 3. And then finally, excited for tomorrow. This is, again, it's all about taking stock and reflecting and getting ready for the day that happened and the day that's coming up. So I write down what I've got going on the next day. And it's interesting. There was a time when I started doing this, right after I started doing this exercise, and I've been doing it every day since December 22nd of last year, and it's been incredibly helpful and beneficial. I had a dentist appointment. And I was thinking to myself, am I really going to write I'm excited for this dentist appointment? I'm decidedly not excited, right? But I was like, okay, it's a good opportunity to engage in some cognitive reframing on the front end, right? I have this thing, I don't want to go to the dentist appointment. I'm a little anxious, a little angry about it, like all sorts of emotions. But, maybe I can appreciate that it's good for my physical well-being, right? I know that. And so it's going to go in self-care the next day. Or maybe I'm excited to get it over with. Or any number of things. And what's interesting is that physiologically speaking, our bodies respond to excitement in really similar ways that they respond to anxiety, right? You get sweaty palms, butterflies in your stomach, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of people who are suggesting that when you find yourself in anxious situations, like you're about to get up and give a presentation or something like that, the conventional wisdom used to be like, try to calm yourself down, deep breaths, things like that. And those can be good strategies. But it's asking a lot of your body, right? Physiologically, it's very difficult to go from a state of anxiety to a state of calm, right? It's a total 180, right? And so what these researchers out of Stanford suggested is that a better solution might be to try to tap into something that you're excited about the situation that you might be anxious for, right? And that's why there's lots of research around like power posing and kind of talking yourself up in the mirror, right? If you watch athletes, there's all sorts of pregame rituals for how to get like jacked and excited about things. And the reason for that is in our bodies, it's just much easier to pivot from anxiety to excitement than anxiety to like calm, right? And it's the same thing that we talked about setting attainable goals, right? When you try to calm yourself down when you're really anxious and it doesn't work, all you're doing is probably going to make yourself more anxious, right? And you're exacerbating the situation potentially, as opposed to alleviating. So I believe that's all my talk. Oh no, well, a couple other talking points here. Okay, the key is, this is just a suggestion. I mean, I created this, I really like it. I'm happy to talk to people about why I chose these categories, but you certainly don't have to do this. You want to take one of these categories, you want to mix and match some, you want to remove some, take some, add different things, whatever. Like, make this yours. It's about having an exercise and a methodology for processing your emotions. The other thing, do not let perfection be the enemy of good, right? We talked about perfectionism a couple of times today. Same thing it happens everywhere, right? Those thinking errors are going to occur every day, all the time. And one of them is that you might think, oh, I couldn't get to it one night, I'm just going to scrap this whole exercise. Or I went a week even. Like, who cares, right? The goal is to do it as much as you can. The more you can habitualize these techniques, the better. But don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And that's it. So happy to stick around if anybody has questions, or if anybody wants to ask questions right now.